Foreign Secretary and former Indian Ambassador to US. And Ambassador Anil Sooklal, who is the High Commissioner of South Africa to India, with a huge round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, let's please welcome the three distinguished diplomats.
Thank you so much, Akanksha, and thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. It's been an entertaining day. We've had some great discussions on GST 2.0, but now let's focus on the geopolitics of it all. Today, there is a lot of uncertainty around the world regarding trade, supply chains, and also weaponization of natural resources. I'm sure every morning when you pick up your phone, you look at your WhatsApp or X or Facebook, there is a bit of shock as to what has happened with regard to global trade and geopolitics, especially with the United States. The H-1B news over the weekend took us with a lot of surprise and shock, but thankfully there is certainty that this will not be affecting current H-1B visa holders. It only applies from the next lottery cycle. Having said that, India definitely is a bright spot in all of this uncertainty. Lots of things going for India, but what more do we need after GST 2.0? So let's begin this panel today, and I'm going to put this first question to Ambassador Höskuldsson. Ambassador Höskuldsson, this couldn't have come at a better time. GST 2.0, rate rationalization, rate reduction, 2 rates only in the country. Just a few days ahead of the EFTA. Ladies and gentlemen, EFTA is the European Free Trade Association, the 4-nation grouping comprising of Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. So India has signed a trade deal with them last year, and the trade deal comes into effect on the 1st of October, a very important trade agreement. So how does this help EFTA investors and especially Iceland now?
Thank you for the question. It's quite important, and it is something that we are quite happy to see happening today, that the GST reform takes place. The Trade and Economic Partnership Agreement between EFTA and India goes into force 1st of October, so that's 8 days from now. This is important in the sense that, you know, the reform basically unifies India as a market, so that we see straight away that, you know, the interstate economy will grow. That's positive for when the investors are looking into, you know, if they should come into India for investments. Secondly, the reform marks really important characteristics for the investors, in the sense that, you know, this becomes a transparent way in which they will comply when it comes to taxes. That's important. Input tax credits will be more transparent and automated, so that it will become easier for the companies to operate, and that will actually leave them also in an area where they will have lesser expenses to comply with the Indian system. So those are very important factors or components of doing business, and we already see this as something that will take place.
Right, and one point that Ambassador was telling us a short while back and off stage is that there is a commitment from EFTA nations to make $100 billion in FDI investment in the country in the next 10 to 15 years. So that's a big amount, ladies and gentlemen. So lots riding on that relationship.
Well, it's very important, and it should be pointed out that the TEPA, as we call the Trade and Economic Partnership Agreement, is a new generation of free trade agreements, in the sense that we, the 4 countries who sign on to it, have pledged and committed to actually invest over $100 billion worth in the next 10 to 15 years, and thereby creating some 1 million jobs. So this is significant, and I'm very happy, actually. I can tell you that already now, today, we already have positive investments coming from Iceland into India on this basis.
Right, and Ambassador, let's move on to the other big topic of attention, that something Donald Trump has been speaking about ever since he took over, and that is BRICS. So he has raised concerns about de-dollarization that the BRICS is going to indulge in, how BRICS will undermine the dollar, how they'll have their own currency that they will be trading in. None of that is really true. But Ambassador Sooklal, if you can give us your view, South Africa, a key member of the BRICS, and BRICS, ladies and gentlemen, is almost 24-25% of global trade right now. Does the GST 2.0 reform in India, will BRICS double down on India as a result of this reform?
Well, I don't think there'll be any doubling down. If any reform comes about that is positive for the country, for its growth, and for its people, especially those that are at the lower rungs of society, I think that's most welcome. Now, let me say that in terms of BRICS and de-dollarization, I think de-dollarization has become a catchphrase. You know, I served as South Africa's BRICS Sherpa for 13 years before being posted here. That was my last portfolio. So I know this whole history. This issue of de-dollarization arose in 2023 during South Africa's chairship. At no stage during the course of that year did South Africa or any five of us at that stage, still BRICS 5, spoke about de-dollarization. But what became a major issue during our chairship was the expansion of BRICS. And this was not well received, especially by our friends in the global north. And it was the Western media that started this whole debate that BRICS has on the agenda de-dollarization. What we had on the agenda is deepening trade in local currency. That was on the agenda, and looking at alternative payment platforms, especially given the unilateral sanctions and the freezing of Russian funds by the Western countries. And we felt that if this could happen to Russia, it could happen to any one of us. So we need to look at our own financial systems and how do we deepen trade between ourselves and trade in local currency. Because way back, I think in 2018, we signed an interbank BRICS agreement. So it was already there for a number of years, but we didn't activate that. And unfortunately, this was taken out of context and the whole focus went on de-dollarization. And up to the present time, I think your foreign minister earlier this year also mentioned that at no stage have we discussed de-dollarization in BRICS. I think India is an important member of the BRICS community. And the reforms that are taking place in India are welcome. Firstly, I'd like to say from a South African perspective and an African perspective, we welcome this because India is not, let me be very frank, not an easy trading environment. For our companies to enter this market, you have multiple layers of regulations and taxes and custom duties at national level, state level. So simplifying this is going to help us better understand, and I think it will also help boost India-African trade. I mean, Africa is an important trading partner for India. We have a modest trade between Africa and India. It's around $100 billion. I know India is very keen to double that. I think we have all the ingredients to do that. We are two major markets, Africa 1.5 billion, you are 1.45 billion. So I think for African businesses, especially the MSME sector, that is very keen to enter the Indian market, these kind of reforms are welcome.
Right, very important points there. And ladies and gentlemen, I missed, and bad on my part, I should have also introduced Ambassador Anil Sooklal, who is with us here in the audience, Ambassador Sooklal's wife. And she's someone who's been a distinguished ambassador to Nepal, India, and Bangladesh, and both them together contributing to India-South Africa relations in a very big way. And they have very strong Indian origins. Ambassador Sooklal hails from a village near Varanasi, and you've got Ambassador Anil, who has been from both Ayodhya and Varanasi, if I'm not wrong. So, ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause to both of them as well. Now, just coming back, Ambassador Civil, I'd like to ask you about the United States. And that's a question I'm sure rattling a lot of us in the audience. I guess the only thing that is certain about the India-US relationship right now is that nothing is certain. is it time for India to strengthen other relationships with BRICS, with South Africa, with the African continent, with the European Union for that matter?
I think our longer-term interest lies in that, and the effort should be made in that direction. But this can't happen overnight. Our biggest trading partner is United States of America, if you take both goods and services. It's the biggest market in the world, huge consumption market, the biggest source of technology and investment. So if you look around, what are the choices we have? With China, we have a $100 billion deficit, and I don't think they're going to make it easy for us. With Russia now, we have a $60 billion deficit. Our exports are about $5 billion. Even if they increase by 100%, it will be $10 billion. It's nothing. In terms of technology and investments, I don't think we have those easy choices. So we have to look at somehow maintaining our market share in the United States and find every possible way, despite Trump and his idiosyncrasies, to nurture this relationship. However, for the next 3.5 years, I think we're going to have a tough time. One option we have, and which is actually a very productive option, is to strengthen our ties with the European Union. The European Union itself is under huge pressure from the United States, the manner in which they have been humiliated in this framework agreement. They are looking for partners also. And they have all the attributes that the United States market has. They have a lot of technology, they have a lot of investment potential, high consumption market. We have $130 billion roughly of trade with them, which is roughly balanced. So we can help each other. So I think this is the time to actually accelerate, if it's possible, the finalization of the FTA. Now, van der Leyen and others are talking very positively about wanting to do that before the end of the year. But whether it can happen or not happen, it's I think, uncertain. One of the issues that has been raised by the Americans, which has complicated our ties, and they are putting pressure on Europe also to go in that direction, is to raise the issue of our oil purchases from Russia. And unfortunately, Brussels is today headed by people who are viscerally anti-Russian. To begin with, the foreign policy chief, who has no concept of geopolitics, frankly. And if they make that an issue and start imposing sanctions on us, which probably they won't, because that will derail the India-EU FTA negotiations. But nevertheless, this is a pressure point. So the long and short is that we have to look at Africa, particularly Latin America, where there's a lot of potential, and we can do much more with that continent. Unfortunately, all our deficits are eastwards, whether it's ASEAN or Japan or China or what have you. So we have to look, now the Middle East, there we can, with the UAE and all, we can expand our economic ties. We have this target now of $100 billion of mutual trade, non-oil trade with the UAE. So with the GCC area, there's a lot of potential. To answer your question, we have to look for alternative partners, and there are some readily on the horizon, with the Europeans and the GCC states, the Gulf states being the most obvious ones.
Right. You know, Ambassador, you're absolutely right. We need to diversify our exports, but also continue the reform push. We can't end at GST as well. And that's a question I'd like to put to you, Ambassador Höskuldsson. GST was a big reform that companies had been demanding, even foreign investors had been asking for. But if we had to utilize the EFTA completely, if the India-EU agreement happens by the end of the year and we want to make full use of that, what more reforms, according to you, are needed in India for ease of doing business, for making India a more attractive place to do business? What could be done?
You're right. You're absolutely right. So the GST reform is maybe the first step in a much longer road ahead. And what the investors looked for are reforms in the labor market, for example, land acquisitions. So there are a host of issues that the investors look to then will need to be addressed in India sooner than later. It also comes to, like in our case, we do think that it's extremely important that, India's work on improving relations with other blocs, such as the EU and others, needs to take place. For us, that supports our efforts because, as you may know, Iceland and Norway particularly are very integrated into the EU economy as a part of the internal market. So it's really important that the pathway forward, actually, the reform doesn't stop here, but actually continues. And there are a host of other issues that need to be addressed, but those would be the most, at least for the foreign direct investments. That's where you need the improvements. But then also the complications. If you talk to our companies, and Norwegians, which we tend to be small and medium-sized companies, it's the bureaucracy, it's the time it takes to do transactions with India that sort of hinders them in a way to do the business. So we need to see those sorts of reforms take place, because for small and medium-sized companies, they don't have the time or the manpower to dwell on these things. Either we do it or they turn their attention to something new.
Or some other country for that matter.
Yes, exactly.
Because when they speak about a China plus one opportunity, which we started hearing Ambassador Sooklal and Ambassador Sibbal during COVID-19, that is an opportunity that is not going to last forever. There are 4 or 5 countries which are competing, and in some labor-intensive areas, some countries like Vietnam, Indonesia are already ahead of India, including Bangladesh. But Ambassador Sooklal, if you spoke about the importance of India-South Africa business relations, also the larger India-Africa relations. It is a very big market for the future. China is already making very big inroads there. What more does India need to do in order to step up India-Africa ties, get India-South Africa closer together, and what could be the next phase of reforms that could probably usher that phase?
Well, if you look historically, in the recent past, India had a larger footprint on the African continent than China. But somewhere along the line, China overtook India. And one of the things I've been saying to my colleagues at MEA and to Indian businesses, India has a massive footprint throughout the African continent. You have an Indian diaspora of about 3.5 million on the African continent. That's substantial. But there's no visibility about what India is doing on the African continent, be it on the trade front, be it on the cultural front, on education. You just opened up an IIT in Zanzibar about 2 years ago, and you're looking at the second one now in Tanzania. And also in terms of the development front. India is quite involved with Africa's development, but we never hear of it. It's so quiet. And this day and age, quietness doesn't help you. You need to also bring visibility so that we as Africans know that India is present in Africa. They are partnering with Africa on all of these different areas. And also the Indian populace. What I have found in the just under a year that I've been here, there's very, very little knowledge on both sides. In India about the African continent, and the opportunities that Africa provides. Africa is rising. 9 of the fastest growing economies of the top 20 in the world today are from Africa. Small economies, but the fastest growing. So I think the last time India had an India-Africa Forum Summit was 10 years ago, in 2015. I was here as part of South Africa's delegation. It can't be that you wait for 10 years to have a summit with the continent. I'm glad that they are now talking about a summit early next year. I think it's very important. Having this strong government-to-government relations between the African continent and India is important. I was very pleased to see President Murmu was in Africa last year, several countries that she visited. Prime Minister Modi was recently in Ghana and Namibia. I think these are important initiatives. But in terms of the private sector, you have a large number. There's about 150 Indian companies, as I said, in South Africa. And I have found that there's a great appetite from the Indian companies wanting to do business with India, and likewise African companies wanting to interact with India. But I think you lose also a valuable opportunity. There are 45 African countries that have embassies here in Delhi. And I've been saying to my MEA colleagues, why don't you interact with us as a collective? In this 1 year I've been here, we haven't had a collective meeting. Just if you take our own region as SADC, the Southern African Development Community, 15 of us. 14 of us have embassies here. We meet on a regular basis. We've been trying to get a collective engagement with MEA, and it's not materialized. So I think it's lost opportunities. Yes, it's important to talk about the will to increase interaction between Africa and India. Prime Minister Nehru referred to Africa as the sister continent. But you need to see action on the ground, and I believe that there is not sufficient there. And I believe both sides are poorer for this. So we need to see how we scale up this and how we bring visibility to the major interactions that are taking place and the vast potential. I mean, $100 billion of trade between Africa and India is a drop in the ocean. That should be $300-400 billion. China is $340 billion. That's what's China's total trade with Africa at the moment. You have a total investment from India and Africa around $75 billion.
Right.
That could be doubled easily. And as I've said, you have major multinationals of India in the African continent and doing very well. And I think the other important point that I'd like to make is that India has a trust positive factor with the African continent.
It's a historical partnership.
It's a historical partnership, but you don't have some of the fault line and challenges that some of the others have, be it through colonialism or new partners that are coming there and exploiting the African continent. You need to actually capitalize on this trust positive identity that you have with the African continent and capitalize on that.
Very important. You need to capitalize on the trust positive environment and that you enjoy in South Africa. Let me get in Ambassador Sibal once again. Ambassador Sibal, help our audience understand, where did this H-1B change, this $100,000 fee, come out of the blue? Yes, there were some MAGA activists who had been calling for this change, but coming so soon after Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi shared those very positive synchronized messages on social media, why do you think this happened? And how should we see this India-US relationship, especially when it comes to mobility of professionals? Would you advise Indian professionals, Indian companies to start looking elsewhere?
Well, firstly, you shouldn't take President Trump at his word, because he can contradict himself anytime. So whether he sent soft messages and that meant that there was a change of heart with regard to his relationship with India would have been a total misinterpretation of his past personality and his character. He blows hot and cold, and I think he thinks that being unpredictable gives him a lot of scope to put the other side under pressure, because the other side doesn't know what he's going to do. And unlike in our case, if the government starts contradicting itself or the Prime Minister starts contradicting himself, the opposition will get at his throat. But in the United States, Trump can contradict himself, and there is no backlash. He's become very powerful within his country, unfortunately. This H-1B visa business has been troubling many of, as you rightly said, his base, the MAGA base, and the myth has been created that they are stealing jobs. And this is part of the general feeling that Trump and his and those around him have all felt that there's been job losses in the United States. Now, whether they have occurred because of China or whether because of H-1B visas, I think this is highly disputable. Those jobs that they really lost are manufacturing jobs. In the IT sector, in fact, whatever we've done is a plus for the US high-tech companies, and they need our skilled people. So this was an absolutely wrong step they took, and they realized immediately that they took a wrong step and they have backtracked. Because this is not only the high-tech sector, it's also the health sector. And that would be a huge problem if that sector started collapsing. So they have stepped back, rightly so, but that's not the end of the story, because he's been hitting us in various ways. 50% tariffs, we are the most tariffed country in the world. Frankly, he's been telling us that we are the tariff king. Now, United States has become the tariff king, if you really look at the tariffs they've imposed on every country. The other interesting thing is that they've always criticized us when we raised our tariffs a couple of years ago, that why are you doing this? You are discouraging American companies from coming in. And what was our rationale for doing so? That we will force them to invest in our country. Precisely what Trump is trying to do by raising tariffs. So, you know, there's no consistency in the American position. He has now imposed sanctions on the Chabahar project, which actually is in no way hurts American interests in any way, in any sense.
But he may have given a win to China.
In fact,
indirectly.
Indirectly, he's building up China's strategic interest in our region by not targeting Gwadar.
Yeah.
And it is through Gwadar that China is increasing its links with the Gulf countries, where the United States has strategic interests. He's weakening us on that score also.
Right.
There's so many other things that we have done, but we have to ride it out.
We have to ride it out. We have to ride it out.
The
Somehow,
relationship is very important.
Yeah.
And we cannot act as erratically.
or knee-jerk. And I think that's the sense, Ambassador, a lot of people in the foreign ministry also say that we are not going to retaliate. We'll do everything that's possible to keep this relationship intact. But Ambassador Höskuldsson, coming to you right now, in this period of immense global uncertainty and US-imposed trade uncertainty, how do you see India vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Vietnam, Indonesia? Does the US crisis make India look more positive, make Iceland or the European Union look more positively at India?
I think I would go back to the reforms and what's needed. That will make India more sort of positive. So just, everybody is now dealing with the fact that there is a risk premium to the U.S. economic policies. Okay, that means that everybody's scrambling. He threw up the global trade network, so everybody's now looking for new partners. India is for sure, absolutely, an important partner for all of the others. What we're looking for is a stable, reliable partners whom you can trust. And right now, India is one of those and will be. So as far as we see it, India is a reliable partner. We have already signed it, and I think that's we are the first one, so that we're happy with that. But India is, but you cannot stop in a sense. You need to make the reforms that this is the beginning. More needs to follow.
More needs to follow. Ambassador Sooklal, the US wants us to reduce relations between BRICS nations because they think that this is an anti-US alliance. We've been repeatedly saying we're not an anti-US alliance. But do you think the BRICS will work even more closely together in this period of uncertainty? There is an economic roadmap that was renewed in the last BRICS summit. What do you think is the thinking within BRICS nations? What is the kind of economic partnership and trade we are going to see over the next 5 years?
Well, I think it's larger than BRICS. The reality is the global south is rising. Countries like India, China, Indonesia, African countries are on the rise. They're no more on the margins, nor do they want to remain on the margins. They're very vocal. India, you introduced during your G20 summit, Voice of the Global South. You had 3 editions of it, where you are constantly pushing forward the agenda of the Global South to address the fault lines in a global community that's global architecture that's outdated. This is very weak. Leaders of the world, well, some leaders of the world, because many important leaders of the world are not converging in New York. And yet it's the 80th anniversary of the founding of the UN. I recall the 70th anniversary. I was part of South Africa's delegation. And the pomp and grandeur celebrating 70 years of the UN, and many pronouncements were made in terms of reform. You rightfully are talking about reforms. But what reform have we seen in the past 10 years in terms of the multilateral architecture? On the contrary, unilateralism has become the norm of the day. And unfortunately today, we are no longer trying to reform the United Nations system. We are rendering it paralyzed, because that's what's happened to the UN system, unfortunately. So we have to constantly, as global South countries, safeguard the multilateral system. It has to be reformed and be fit for purpose for the global reality of today and not 1945. And I think the last point is, all of these measures that are being taken by the Trump administration, be it against India, we also as South Africa have been hit with 30% tariff that's impacting on us quite severely. It's part of the US policy, not just under Trump, of containment. As soon as you see the global South, countries of the global South rising, they tried it with Japan. When Japan started growing double digits in the 1960s, they made sure they stopped that. Japan went into stagnation. They've tried it with China, they still continue with China. Now they can see a rising India, and all predictions are in the next 10, 20 years where India will be. And that is not a comfort position for a country that wants to occupy that space solely by itself. But the world is changing and the global South is rising, and BRICS is an important platform that will provide this.
Absolutely, Ambassador Sooklal. Those are great words. My final question to Ambassador Sibal, we've run out of time, but Ambassador Sibal, as someone who's watched India for decades now, you've seen the 91 reforms, and currently we're in a crisis. What we're seeing with the US right now is a crisis, and one should make good use of a crisis. So if you had to make one or two recommendations to the Indian government to do something right now which will make India a very attractive destination and will usher in the next phase of growth, what would that be?
Well, I think there are better minds than me who've been addressing this issue, and it's become more pressing after the difficulties we're having with the United States. Clearly, we have to go in for the second set of reforms, deeper reforms. Everybody is agreed on that. What the nature of those reforms should be can always be discussed. Less regulation, or at least more efficient regulatory practices, helping build our MSME sector, which is going to be the backbone of our economic growth going into the future, making investments in India easier, ease of business. That's never ending. Now the ambassador of Iceland talked about reforms in our country. You will always be under pressure from investing countries to go in for reform. They'll never be satisfied. They'll never say that this is enough, because they would always want it that the ecosystem in India should be more congenial for foreign investment, and for the Americans, they would want to have the same kind of system here that they have in America, which they are used to, which is not going to happen. And anyway, the other thing, of course, which is not relating to reform, but in a way it is. It is this Atmanirbharta. It's extremely important, important, because more self-reliant you are, more attractive you will become as a partner. Because you will deal with the world more equally. So at the moment, there are a lot of pressure points on us. China, why is there less pressure points? Because China has developed its own capacities.
It's self-reliant.
So if you develop your own capacities, your bargaining power increases. And finally, on the defense side, extremely important that we develop the capability to defend ourselves. Then we are much less vulnerable to all kinds of pressures that we may be subject to in the future.
Very important. I think for India, the focus needs to be on Atmanirbharta, Atmanirbharta, Atmanirbharta. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and Ambassador Höskuldsson, Ambassador Sooklal, and Ambassador Sibal for joining us for this fantastic masterclass on geopolitics in the India context.
Thank you, Ambassador Höskuldsson. Thank you, Ambassador Sooklal and Ambassador Sibal, for your perspectives, very precious ones, especially on the future of globalization, as Parikshit said, from the India context. And thank you so much, Parikshit, for that very engaging conversation. With that, we'll now pause the discussions for a quick break. Let's now join back